It's Nicholas here to talk about consilience and integration, focusing on three aspects: what UTOC calls Mind-2, or phenomenally conscious mind, matter, however we conceive of that, and mathematics as natural science's way to describe matter behaviors. So the primary claims I'll address in this presentation are that natural and social sciences can't be consilient if natural science is based on the current form of mathematical physics. Second, it's impossible to create a coherent discipline of psychology relative to that form of physics. And third, unfortunately, it is possible to revise mathematical physics using data from a novel mainstream experiment so that it can support consilience and a real psychology. To clarify overall context first, work described here is essentially metatheoretic, meaning that it considers these two theory groups, natural and social sciences, as data points. But perhaps unusually for metatheory, resolving the relationship between these two groups requires detailed investigation inside the foundation of the natural sciences collection, specifically into the content of mathematical physics. Now, the central issue will be phenomenal consciousness or subjective conscious experience, and how the structure of current mathematical physics in relation to phenomenal consciousness gives rise to an insurmountable conflict or divide between as-is natural science and the complex of social sciences. Now, although phenomenal or P-consciousness is often the province of philosophers, I'll show that this divide isn't resolvable in philosophy, although philosophical confusion does obscure the terrain. The issue isn't about how P-consciousness populates the natural world or what it's made of. It's about what it can, or more precisely can't do, according to current physics. Fortunately, again, although current physics instantiates a hard stop on natural social science consilience, there is a specific shift in physics that enables consilience, and a specific immanent critique that can engender that shift. But naturally, that immanent critique is based in the language of the relevant domain, which is, of course, primarily mathematical. So this presentation is in part a translation for metatheoreticians into their primarily verbal language of extant work expressed centrally in mathematical formalism. I will get a bit mathematical symbolic later in this presentation, but I'll keep it as minimal as possible and shoot for a relatable verbal expression of formal symbols. So let's get into the basic issue, which concerns the relationship between the matter realm and the realm of phenomenal consciousness, or subjective, qualia-enacted experience. This topic is fundamental to the natural social science relationship because the objective knowledge content of natural science describes what happens in the matter realm, and subjective conscious experience is the basic epistemic access point for the social sciences. So, is the problem for natural social science essentially David Chalmers' so-called hard problem? How does phenomenal consciousness come to be? Why does it? And how can we study all of that? So actually, the immediate problem for consilience isn't how or why phenomenal consciousness exists relative to matter. It's whether the information content of phenomenal consciousness can be transferred into the matter realm and affect the dynamics of the matter brain. Both current physics, as I'll explain in this presentation, and philosophers' causal closure, self-evidently, forbid the transfer of information from P-consciousness into the matter brain. What are the behavioral implications of this? First, let's look at a behavior that isn't forbidden by forbidding P-causality. That's the causality of phenomenal consciousness. Namely, making a report whose semantic content is something like neuronal activity includes the encoding of green light incidents. As I'll explain later, what I call conventional emergence in science easily allows that a high-level system such as a brain in a body can enact this kind of behavior, because the causal chain and associated information flow all lie entirely on the left-hand side in the matter realm. In contrast, consider someone saying, I'm currently experiencing the tree's greenness, meaning I'm reporting directly on the contents of my phenomenal experience. For this to be meaningful, veridical, information about greenness, as opposed to redness, say, must cross from right to left. So there must be causality of right on left, so to speak. So conversely, clearly these sorts of reports can't be veridical if current physics is correct, including its prohibition on any behavior being driven or caused by phenomenal properties. Again, no phenomenal causality follows directly from what causal closure means, but it might be far less obvious that current physics carries the same implication. So the first and most arduous part of the work reported here is actually to establish this implication for physics rigorously, using only the methods of physics. Now, although the basic issue for consilience is not the hard problem directly, as I note here, the implication of both current physics and causal closure is that the hard problem is actually impossible if current physics and causal closure are accurate descriptions of our universe. And this is an if. We will eventually want to test it experimentally, not argue about it subjectively or theoretically. Okay, to sum all that up, the basic issue for consilience and a basic issue for creating a real discipline of psychology is the causal power, so to speak, of phenomenal consciousness over the matter brain, which is forbidden by causal closure and also by current mathematical physics, as I'll show at least at an overview level. Now, when phenomenal causality is forbidden, there are no veridical speech acts or behaviors of any kind about subjective experience. One way to see how this makes the hard problem impossible is that it implies we can't even define phenomenal consciousness. If that seems bizarre, a view I'll come back to in a few slides when discussing the alleged obviousness of phenomenal causality, try reading Dan Dennett's Consciousness Explained. In my take, he's exactly trying to convey a position in which phenomenal consciousness exists but can't be spoken about. So what connects the basic issue of phenomenal causality with consilience? If we accept current physics, which we have to if we accept current natural science, there's no causal role for subjectivity, there are no phenomenal reports, so there's no social science. Conversely, if we accept the validity of social sciences, we have to allow that subjective experience is reportable and therefore causal. So we contradict current natural science. Okay, let's just take a quick look at some other alleged issues around a science of subjectivity, mainly to clarify this basic central p-causality issue. One major objection to using so-called introspective reports in so-called objective science is that private data, like thoughts and feelings, can't be verified by others. But it's important to realize that the experiential visual scene is also private and interior, if we assume representationalism or indirect realism, which is arguably the only scientific position about exteroceptive experience. So if we deny scientific status to reports from the interior because of privacy, we have to deny scientific status to data like conscious visual experience of meter readings, including this thermometer here. Now, one way around this privacy of exteroception is to make an abductive assumption that similar enough brains produce similar enough experiential representations. So then I can assume your private experience of a thermometer is close enough to mine to do science. Now, right here is one crucial edge that the so-called science of consciousness has plunged over. Because although we can and must, I think, axiomatize similar enough production of experience, we can't axiomatize report of produced experience, as Chalmers has suggested, if our framework is supposed to cohere with current physics. Because current physics says no p-causality, as I'll show, Introducing an axiom that phenomenal experience is causal just raises up and nails blatantly home the latent contradiction that this presentation is all about. In summary, then, it's important to disambiguate privacy and p-causality issues. They're neighbors, but they're not the same. Then briefly, a couple of other issues sometimes brought up to object to sciences involving subjectivity are the problems of other minds and of inverted qualia. Now, these can be addressed using the same abductive axiom that I pointed to for the privacy problem. So essentially, we're left with p-causality as the difficult, unresolved issue for subjective and social sciences if we are accepting as is natural science. Okay, returning to phenomenal causality then. Every time I try to raise this issue with meta-theoreticians, I hear that someone has already solved it. Bhaskar, Wilbur, James, Honneth. This pattern in which cultural gatekeepers insist there's nothing to see here is a real problem for making any advances. The first step to getting help is admitting the problem, so it's said. Okay, in addressing claims that p-causality has already been solved, it's useful to introduce Utok's varieties of mind, because Utok is the only meta-theory that's gone detailed on consciousness and mind. Notably, naming Mind-2 as the level or layer that could originate a report about subjective greenness, and Mind-1 as the layer that would report solely on neuronal encoding, a contrast that I already demonstrated pictorially. And, which I'm going to show, at least at an overview level, divides the kind of mind that current physics can allow. Specifically, current physics naturally and easily allows for reports originating from Mind-1, but completely denies reports originating from Mind-2, which is why, of course, current physics blocks not just consilience, but also a real psychology. Okay, returning to the already solved claims. In the interest of brevity, or relative brevity, I'll just talk here to claims for critical realism and Wilberian integral. For critical realism, the claim is usually that Bhaskar dispensed with any natural social science conflict via what he called synchronic emergent powers. But this construct, which is the same as what I call conventional emergence, only deals with Utok's Mind-1, that is information-based brain activity, and not with Mind-2, the case of phenomenal consciousness. What about integral theory? I recall that Wilbur said something like, there's no hard problem for integral because everything's consciousness already. But as Max Fellmans has pointed out, idealisms in general have a hard problem of matter, which leads back to the basic issue of phenomenal causality. Any idealism that's consistent with current physics must reproduce physics-predicted behaviors for its matter analogues. Those matter analogues, by virtue of the current physics constraint, can't then be affected by human phenomenal consciousness. Because, again, as I'll show later in overview, that's what physical theory currently says. And in fact, this is a litmus test for any claims to have already solved the basic issue. If the allegedly resolving approach is consistent with current physics, it can't have resolved the issue because current physics gives rise to it. And if the approach is not consistent with current physics, that's totally fine. But then, does it have a way to change current physics' mind, so to speak? And does it acknowledge its own current non-coherence with current physics? I will say I hear a lot these days about meta-theory becoming more scientific, which is pretty ironic, honestly, because I've yet to see a meta-theory that's actually coherent with the content of natural science in any precise or rigorous way. Science isn't just method. It's also a coherent or consilient single unified body of knowledge. So we can't get to scientific meta-theory, quote unquote, by method alone. A corpus of scientific meta-theory would also tightly couple with natural science as a body of knowledge. Now, to me, these seemingly endless claims of already solved evidence a coherence failure in meta-theory. They show a failure to really understand what natural science currently says, leading to a failure to create a consilient unity. Perhaps controversially, I do think metatheorists tend to see natural science and physics in particular as somewhat reductive and materialist, and themselves as superior to or more evolved relative to the content of natural science, which is all a tragic mistake, frankly. Anyway, let's turn to a different issue now. Something that may have been troubling you when I talk about current physics denying phenomenal causality or p-causality. Isn't it just obvious that phenomenal consciousness plays a causal role? That when I say I saw a green tree, it's the greenness in my conscious experience that's causally pivotal to my report. Why should we need to prove that to physics or even debate it? Well, first off, of course, there are tons of things that are obvious but not true. The Earth is flat, for example, at one end of a spectrum, and the visual scene is the physical world directly at the other. And then, even if many physicists agree that phenomenal causality is plausible or even very likely, as we've already seen, there are other explanations, e.g., for talking about green. Those other explanations are congruent with current physics relative to the status quo. Giving causality to phenomenal consciousness is a dramatic and radical structural change. And structural change in physics only happens relative to strong experimental evidence. So, for example, adding the Higgs boson to the pre-existing particle zoo required statistical evidence beyond 5 standard deviations, and that was for an in-paradigm change. Suffice to say, even if what seems subjectively obvious is true here, justification in the culture of physics doesn't typically admit obvious, certainly for countercultural change. So just claiming it's obvious doesn't solve the transformation of physics problem, and that must be solved for consilience. Okay. So now we've taken a first pass over the basic phenomenal causality issue, its relationship to consilience, and how claims for already solved and obviously causal don't get the job done. Let's look at the central line which will give us a new form of physics that is consilience capable. Typically, the card that's played to get out of causal closure jail, at least in scientific settings, is some form of emergentism. If we can say P consciousness is emergent, and if we can say emergent properties have causal powers, aren't we home free? Well, maybe, but certainly not in that very straightforward way. First, we need a careful and precise analysis of emergence according to mathematical physics. From this, we'll see that what UTOC calls Mind-1, essentially an encoding of information level, certainly can be conventionally emergent and can be said to have causal powers. But Mind-2, or phenomenal consciousness, cannot be conventionally emergent, which means it can't be emergent at all in current physics. Nevertheless, we'll see that we can extend physics to admit something called Qualia-valued emergence as a specific variation on the kind of emergence physics currently allows. However, even if we extend current physics to allow for Qualia-valued emergence, we need to make a further, much more radical and controversial amendment to allow for phenomenal causality or causality of Qualia-valued information. The causality amendment is the kind of new physics that definitively requires very strong experimental evidence. It's quite straightforward to describe experiments that could establish this kind of evidence. They compare actual brain data, for example, from a conscious human, with a current physics simulation of that human's brain. Actual versus simulated divergences then occur if the phenomenal realm couples bidirectionally with the actual brain, because phenomenal causality, the causality from the phenomenal to the matter, won't be modeled in the simulation. Okay, so just as a reminder, what's at stake in all this? It's both consilience, notably a tight enough coupling of natural and social sciences to respond effectively to the meta crisis, and relatedly, the sort of physics that can ground a real psychology, a psychology which bridges matter and mind, natural and social sciences. Next, we're going to go through steps B and C in the central line in a series of slides that are all titled Overview, because even the detailed level I'm about to share now is still a very high-level summary. Okay, as a background setup for this exposition, let's return to the picture that I showed earlier, now naming a division between the two sides as an epistemic veil, and emphasizing the variety of ontologies that we can imagine here on the left. Now, natural science, including physics, can allow for any ontological imagination over here, as long as they all instantiate the mathematical content of current physics. So, although this unlimited variety of science-congruent ontologies isn't the main point here, it does refute a somewhat out-of-date substance-materialist critique of natural science. The main point, though, is that if every unseen ontology must reproduce the same mathematical content to be science-congruent, we're free to use the most mathematically distilled ontology, namely computationalism, to reason scientifically about the matter realm. Now, despite the fact that I explicitly throw in this mathematician's phrase without loss of generality, I do frequently hear that reasoning presented here only follows if the matter realm really is computationalist. So that, for example, implications may not hold if substance materialism or some other ontology actually holds. So just emphasize again here, and I'll say it again at the end, that scientific reasoning, as if computationalism were true, is actually ontologically general here. Because, for example, let's take substance materialism. The substance would have to follow the exact same mathematics as a science-congruent computationalism. Okay, with this background in hand, we now start into analysis proper, with a look at the mathematical symbolism for Mind-1 or informational encoding. Now, I know a lot of people have a sort of math allergy, so please take a breath if that's you. This overview will be more like introducing a few basic words in a foreign language than trying to use complex syntactical rules of that language to justify claims. Okay, so here we have language for the visual environment. A set, denoted by curly brackets, of various stimuli S at locations R sub K in the external environment. The I subscript for S includes different stimuli kinds or classes, for example, colors as opposed to oriented edges, while the J subscript indexes various different instances within a kind, for example, the different experienceable colors in the color class. So a given set of stimuli leads to stereotypical brain activity, denoted by A here, at brain locations labeled by R sub L. Yeah, that's correct. Now, EIJKL is a set of conditions on this collection of brain activities which are fulfilled if and only if the brain can be interpreted to be encoding the stimuli Sijk at Rk. Okay, I'll give a simpler example on the next couple of slides. But then, if brain activity is consistent with encoding of the Sij, the brain body can make reports R whose semantic content, indicated by these surrounding quotes, is neuronal encoding activity reflects the existence of Sij at Rk. Okay, let's do a simpler example. In a simpler example of the same notational flow, let's isolate a single stimulus component from the audiovisual setting. Here, the emission of green wavelength light, and I'm changing the symbolism slightly. I'm going to label that green light by the symbol lambda G, and it's emitted from the location indexed by coordinates R1. Okay, then here I use a simpler notation for encoding too. Let's see. So now A is now thought of as the neuronal firing rate. And then there's some threshold rate, theta, that corresponds to encoding reactivity if the firing rate's above theta. Then specific neuronal firing rates, again at locations, I've switched to R sub M, okay, are above theta if and only if the brain is encoding green light from R1. And then, if the brain is encoding that activity, then a report of that encoding is consistent and veridical. Okay, so we develop all this notation. It's actually an entirely unsurprising current physics account of Mind-2, which is about informational encoding and its behavioral report. We do all that symbolic work mainly so we can compare and contrast symbolism from Mind-2, the realm of phenomenal consciousness. So we can see if Mind-2 can fit into the same mathematical physics framework that's used for the matter realm, even in principle. So the first thing that we need is symbolism for Mind-2's phenomenal consciousness. And the very simple but completely previously overlooked move that unlocks everything is to introduce a symbol, angle brackets, lambda g, into mathematical physics for the typical human greenness experience that occurs when light with wavelength lambda g hits the retinae. Now, why is this notation such a huge breakthrough? Well, for the first time, we can speak scientifically both about matter and phenomenal consciousness sides of this picture in the same symbolic language. So we can now explore questions about explanation and causality for both sides, again, in that common language. Now, over here on the left, in a conventional mathematical language, we have all of current physics, including every instance of what I'll call conventional emergence. I'll explain conventional emergence a little later. But for now, maybe take it as read or on trust that this is the same thing as what Carl Gillette calls scientific emergence, for those familiar with his work. And because everything over here is quantified, or at least in principle computable, in terms of real numbers, conventionally emergent properties are real numbered computations too. In contrast, what can we say about the properties over here on the right-hand side? Well, they are numerically indexable, e.g. by the wavelengths of incident light for color experience, but their properties are not fully accounted for by their index numbers. The angle brackets notation here specifically accords them a further phenomenal quality. Then it follows directly from the real valued character of conventionally emergent properties in the matter realm and the contrasting Qualia-valued character of the angle brackets labeled phenomena that make up Mind-2 here on the right, that Mind-2 cannot be conventionally emergent. Okay, so one analogy here is a contrast between the real and imaginary numbers. If you only have multiplication, division, addition, subtraction, arithmetic, as a way to combine real numbers, you can't get to any imaginary number. So let's just make up this language. We could say imaginary numbers are not arithmetically emergent from the real numbers because they have a character that real numbers don't have, and arithmetic only makes real numbers from real numbers. Analogously, conventionally emergent properties are all real valued. Qualia-valued data has an additional character. So Qualia-valued Mind-2 is not conventionally emergent from physical fundamentals. So Qualia-valued Mind-2 can't be conventionally emergent in a scientific sense because all conventionally emergent properties are real numbers and Qualia-valued data isn't. But that doesn't mean that Mind-2 isn't some other kind of emergent. In fact, we could define Qualia-valued emergence as the satisfaction of brain conditions for the contingent instantiation of specific experiential colors, shapes, sounds, and other senses. Here, X defines the subset of encoding dynamics that lead to instantiation of experience. So for example, for color, little neurobiology, we have a hierarchical structure of distributed neural activity in the eyes, the thalamus, and then primary visual cortex, and then higher V2, V4, and so on. So the encoding set over here, this set of A, would include all of these perhaps, whereas, I mean, let's just say that it's V4 that is necessary and sufficient for experience of green. V4 activity is then what this X-limited set picks out of the larger encoding activity. It picks out the neural correlates or causes or associates of phenomenal consciousness, depending on your language preference. So I'm not saying that V4 is my theory of visual P consciousness. I'm just illustrating the difference between a potentially larger set of encoding dynamics and a possible subset of neural correlates, causes, whatever. Okay. I've suggested the term Qualia-valued emergence could be used for the natural law relationship between the X-limited subset of encoding dynamics and the Qualia-valued aspects of phenomenal consciousness they give rise to, here labeled or pointed to by angle brackets lambda g. And it's important to acknowledge that this emergence is structurally different from conventional emergence, in which high-level numeric properties inhere simply, directly, to different configurations of fundamental entities. Here, it's more like different brain dynamical configurations. Let's see, I don't want to say this. Create or instantiate Qualia-valued arrays, present moment experience. So maybe something like Qualia-valued contingent instantiation might be another appropriate name. Now, in any case, whatever terminology we use, Seth's so-called real problem of consciousness is then the empirical work involved in characterizing the relationship between subsets of encoding dynamics and conscious experience. Now, in fact, the real problem is more complex than the one depicted here, because this overview has left out those brain dynamics which enable global conscious experience and focused only on the brain activity that encodes local components or aspects. However, this simplification, which, the more general case can be captured symbolically too, but this simplification doesn't affect reasoning about the emergent character of P consciousness. Now, is the real problem the be-all and end-all of so-called consciousness science? Is it, in fact, that part of natural science that explains individual subjective experience in objective terms and thus provides a doorway to consilience of natural and social sciences? Well, it could be, provided that we can collect all the required data. But that means there has to be a veridical phenomenal report encapsulated by this new R symbolism, where the contents inside the quotes are now angle brackets pointing to P consciousness, not ENC pointing to brain encoding activity. And this brings us back to the basic problem, the point that causal closure, philosophically, denies this kind of report. And what I promised was a demonstration that current physics, even emergence-based accounts of P consciousness that seem to offer a get-out-of-jail card, also forbid reports of P consciousness. So let's get to that right now. How current physics forbids phenomenal report. It's essentially a structural argument that shares strong parallels with how we saw that P consciousness isn't conventionally emergent. The difference is that the prior argument was about valuedness on left and right-hand sides at a given point in time. Logic here concerns movement of value over time. Now, because we can assume computational ontology without loss of generality, all causality in physics, and therefore all causality in natural science, concerns the movement of one set of real numbers to another set of real numbers. Now, that number-to-number causality on the left-hand side isn't contradicted by a proposal that some set of numbers corresponding to certain brain states contingently instantiates some Qualia-valued phenomena on the right-hand side. So this green arrow, Qualia-valued emergence, if we're going to call it that, doesn't call for new fundamental physics, just for a new conception of emergence and a new causality of matter in another non-matter domain. But now for there to be veridical phenomenal report, there has to be action of Qualia-valued information back on the numeric physics domain. So this is new causality on matter, which means that the way that numbers on the left-hand side were moving before this blue arrow came into action is changed by the transfer of Qualia-valued information back to the matter brain. So, whereas new causality of matter in creating or instantiating Qualia-valued information is only a sort of weak new physics because it doesn't affect the movement of numbers on the left, only what's occurring on the right. This action back from the right on the left is definitively and strongly new fundamental physics. It changes the mathematical laws giving an active role to angle brackets labeled phenomenon. Now, when I said at the very beginning that the basic issue dividing natural and social sciences is about what P consciousness can or can't do according to current mathematical physics, it's about that rather than what P consciousness is made of. This is what I meant. Here, we have an ontologically general setting. The problem applies to idealism, extended physicalisms, panpsychism, whatever you like. And the problem is that current physics denies the causality of Qualia-valued information over matter, meaning we need new mathematical physics for consilience between natural and social sciences. Now, if you want to change the mathematical so-called laws of physics, you need hard experimental data, as I mentioned. The experiment that can show Qualia-valued Mind-2 is causal over brain activity, and that therefore physical law does need to be radically revised is what I call the one experiment. As I mentioned, its essential form is the comparison of detailed recordings of the activity, for example, of a conscious human brain, with a detailed computer simulation of the same brain, but under current physics. So if the actual brain has bidirectional information exchange with the Qualia-valued realm, so that brain activity both influences the content of phenomenal consciousness and is systematically influenced by it, the blue arrow, then there will be correspondingly systematic divergences between actual and simulated brain activity. Now, it's really hard to overstate the seismic revolution in science that a divergent observation of this kind would generate. The European Enlightenment of around about the 18th century was arguably built on the insights of Newton, whose legacy to this day, even through relativistic, quantum, and neo-Darwinian revolutions in science, has been bottom-up causation with causal entities confined to physics. Causal P consciousness would put Mind-2, in a sense, in a very specific sense, on the same level as quarks and electrons, causally speaking. Might that engender the beginning of a second enlightenment? Okay, let's wrap up now with 4 topics. A little more detail on what conventional emergence is, revisit of the emergence status of Utah's Mind-1, a brief flyby of the immanent critique expression of this work I mentioned earlier, and a quick dip into alternative frames for explaining P consciousness and potential criticisms of the approach shown here. Okay, concerning emergence, here I'll contrast emergence as it is used in a natural science consensus with some philosophical and pop science characterizations. So the way in which I use the term is coherent, I believe, with Carl Gillette's scientific reductionism and emergentism, although my usage originates from my own time in mathematical physics and computational neuroscience, and so it's a sort of cultural anthropological report based on first-person experience Gillette's work just happens to cohere with that distillation. So here we have an early example of what some metatheoreticians and philosophers often call emergence, the structure and properties of a proton relative to its quark constituents, noting that the 3-quark model shown here is only a low energy approximation. But the point is, what I mean by conventional emergence in the natural sciences, it's then the quantified property set of any higher level organization relative to its lower level constituents, although I don't know any scientists who would actually call the proton emergent. It's just what happens to quarks in the right energy setting. But anyway, of course, when we're looking at phenomenal consciousness in the brain, we're in the realm of biology, not nuclear physics. Now, conventional emergence doesn't imply that biology, the discipline, is replaceable by physics. In particular, because the ways humans want to understand biological systems, for example, in terms of function, is quite linguistically different than the ways we want to understand protons and atoms. Nevertheless, conventional emergence includes the point that biological facts are physical facts, and physical facts are mathematical facts. Although, again, causal powers isn't language scientists would typically use. If they did, it would be in the sense of interaction properties that are in principle computable from elementary entity definitions. And explicitly, this kind of definition, it includes rather than disallows Gillette's so-called scientific emergentism. So scientific reductionism and emergentism aren't two different positions. They're two sides of the same coin. So here's this thing that he calls macresis, or in a very specific example, also Hull's macrocausation, coarse graining and fine graining and so on. They're all consistent with this definition of conventional emergence. So this is the same idea as when I said current physics causality is constrained to number value calculations in the matter realm in my earlier overview of new symbolism. Okay, next, I just want to demonstrate explicitly, maybe for the second time actually, a result I mentioned in the statement of the central line to a new physics-based consilience, and that was implicit in the symbolism development, but not actually directly stated there. And that is the fact that Mind-1 or informational report obviously can be conventionally emergent. We can trace the mathematical physics detail of green light hitting the retinae of a human subject and giving rise to emitted, this purple line encapsulates typical neural patterns that encode green light incidents propagating through various areas, and all that neural activity is encoding activity schematically depicted by this green circle. And then we can similarly trace the mathematical physics detail, for example, maybe this is motor cortex activity, drawing on the green encoding and generating a speech act whose veridical semantic content is neuronal encoding reflects green light incidence, the kind of speaking that I earlier symbolized with this R of Enc notation. So that this kind of high-level system output can happen is entirely uncontroversial in natural science. And really the main reason to emphasize this is to point out that the other kind of report of phenomenal content can't happen under current physics, but the two are often confused. Now, obviously, I'm not the first person to point out problems with Qualia-valued report. But this work, to my knowledge, is the first framework that can establish these problems in an extended mathematical physics framework, namely one that's extended by angle brackets formalism. And that extended physics framework then sets the stage for bringing all this home to physics. I mentioned right at the top that the mainly verbal, informal, metatheoretical exposition here is really a report of an existing immanent critique of natural science, aimed at catalyzing the shift from current physics to a form that first recognizes angle bracket symbols and then experimentally explores the causal powers of angle brackets labeled phenomena over the conventional physical brain. In the next few slides, I review from 30,000 feet the most succinct presentation of this critique, and I'm doing this just for demonstration purposes. So the succinct version can be given in a single A4 page, though of course, setting up the context for a single page exposition typically takes somewhere between 10 and 300 pages, depending on the reader's prior familiarity and intellectual inclination. But anyway, this slide shows the first half of that single page. We may recognize some things from the earlier symbolism overview. There's an S for a stimulus, and there's an angle brackets S for the experience of stimulus. So those are notations we've seen before. And then there are definitions of conventional and Qualia-valued emergence. Those are things that we've seen before. Now, one thing that pervades this exposition is this H notation, which I didn't bring in earlier because I was sparing you mathematical syntactics. So the H is the Hamiltonian formalism in mathematical physics, which can be used to characterize the dynamical behaviors and interactions of high level systems with lower level parts and features and so forth. Okay. Here's the second half of that single page demonstration. So here, definitions and axioms from the previous page and on this page are developed into a single lemma and a single theorem, which apply in the context of what definition D6 calls dynamically orthodox physics. Now, this dynamically orthodox physics is a structural generalization of current mathematical physics. It delineates a class of possible future developments of physics that nevertheless preserve the conventional emergence heart of its current form, proving results that hold for any future form of physics consistent with the current structure, avoids the, oh, well, physics can change, and so, you know, we could get phenomenal causality and Qualia-valued emergence into those, no problem. So using this D6 definition blocks that kind of escape. Now, of course, physics can change, and we want it to. But there's only one kind of change that allows for a science of P-consciousness. So when we get down to this final theorem here, it states that we can't do any form of P-consciousness science under dynamically orthodox physics, which means, for example, Seth's real problem approach isn't viable under current physics, because current physics is a particular instance of the larger D6 class. Okay. So these sorts of proof of the inability of current physics to mount the science of phenomenal consciousness are only about a third of the content of the full critique. A second part is the characterization of the specific kind of physics that can support P-consciousness science, and also to point out tests for whether we actually live in a universe described by that kind of physics. For example, the one experiment we saw earlier. And then there's a third part, transferring the implications of the D6 physics theorem from consciousness science to the epistemological foundations of science as a whole. And this comes back to the privacy p-causality problem for scientific epistemology that I talked about a lot earlier. So the idea here is that consciousness science doesn't really want to hear about this work because it seems to derail its potentially Nobel Prize winning effort to explain p-consciousness by using current physics. And physicists don't really want to hear about this work because it points to a radical restructuring of their discipline to deal with issues that most of them don't care about. So this third part, which points out that we can't rely on the conscious experience of a thermometer reading as scientific data under D6 physics, aims to apply the critique method to the foundations of natural science as a whole, adding the status of natural science to the explanatory limitations of both physics and consciousness science as ways to evoke or provoke interest in empirical tests such as the one experiment. Okay, almost finally. A brief nod to some frameworks I haven't mentioned in this presentation and some potential criticisms of the approach that I have described. Concerning like possibly neglected approaches in philosophy of mind and consciousness science, well, there's a very long list, not shown here. But probably the most significant is philosophical identity theory, which can try to give causal powers to Qualia-valued information by saying that, for example, an experience of redness is identical to certain firing patterns in a specific set of neurons. Now, this idea is worth examining because it works, if it does, by a specific form of denial of the left-hand, right-hand matter P consciousness picture that I've used throughout. And as ingenious as this is, close examination shows that it's still not enough to avoid fatal problems for current physics consciousness science and phenomenal causality. Because what's needed are not just generic causal powers, but powers sufficient to make phenomenal report driven by actual phenomenal contents. Giving redness and greenness as Qualia-valued information additional causal power does that. Folding redness and greenness into already laws of physics numerically explained brain dynamics simply creates an epiphenomenal view of P consciousness. Okay, and I list here like some other cases people sometimes pull up in response to this work, property dualism to IIT. But I think, in fact, for all these cases, you, the viewer, are already fully equipped to see how the approach is named here. And any other on a long, potentially infinitely long list don't and can't resolve P causality problems if they're coupled with current physics. Okay, so I'll leave all that as exercises for the viewer for now. Really nearly finally then, I'll just document here some criticisms that might be made about the mathematics of conventional emergence approach that I've centrally employed here. I really don't think it's fair to call this work overly reductive. I mean, mainly because it seeks to expand current mathematical physics first into a version of non-reductive physicalism concerning P-consciousness. And nor is it fair to say, as I mentioned earlier, that the transient working assumption of a computationist ontology is too narrow for the reasons that I rehearsed earlier. If we're doing physics congruent science, if we do adopt any ontology from substance matter to turtles and fairies, as long as the mathematical implications of that ontology equal the current physics computations, at least in principle. Okay, well, that's been a lot, to put it mildly. To summarize, the current content of mathematical physics is a major, possibly the major obstacle to both natural social science consilience and a real discipline of psychology. I focused on the former, but it should be clear that any real psychology must address the relationship between subjective phenomenal consciousness mind and objective brain. And the culture of physics means that its current mathematical content can only be revised by experimental data, meaning that we need an immanent critique to help physics into doing the required experiments. The crucial experiment to probe potential causality of Mind-2 or P consciousness is what I call the one experiment, comparing actual brain data with current physics simulations and looking for systematic divergences between the two ensuing data sets. Finally, what's at stake? I mean, I know this is the third time, at least I've said this, but I think it's really important to reiterate because the apparently esoteric nature of reasoning here can make us miss the real world impact. This is the only path to an objective knowledge system that recognizes the capacity of subjectivity to speak. And so it's the only way to create a metatheoretic integration of natural and social sciences, and it can also let spirituality in down the track, but I haven't talked about that, that's precise enough, tight enough to mount an effective meta-crisis response, which, in fact, is why I got into this whole game to begin with. I'm Nicholas. Thanks for watching. I hope to connect again soon.